Pulsar has absolutely been doing the most recently. It almost feels like they're pumping out a new mouse every month, and today we'll see if that's a good or a bad thing. If you've been following me on Twitter, you probably already know what's happened, but despite my issues, I still think that this is an absolute banger of a shape and something pretty unique on the market. But before we get into any of that, I do want to mention that this was indeed sent out to me by Pulsar, but that does not affect any of my opinions, as you will see soon in this video. I also do want to mention that I'd really appreciate if you would subscribe and also hit the notification bell right next to it if you're at all interested in these types of videos. Especially if you're interested in seeing my full review of the Superlight 2C. Anyway, before we get into the unboxing experience, let's get into the list of issues. This was the first mouse that I had. I unboxed this thing live on stream over on Twitch. I went into the WebDriver and was quickly prompted that I had to upgrade the firmware on the mouse. I then tried to do that, but that failed miserably inside of the WebDriver. So I decided to download the actual software that Pulsar has, followed all instructions, even tried it with a stock cable, and the firmware upgrade just straight up failed. I then could no longer use my mouse, I could not pair it to the dongle anymore, and I had a strong suspicion that the dongle itself was actually bricked. So I used the 8K dongle from my Crazy Light, tried to pair it with the mouse, and that worked. I thought all was fine, maybe just the dongle firmware somehow bricked the dongle itself. I continued to stream, and then after stream ended, I spent a lot of time trying to upgrade the firmware anyway and see if it actually works, because I had a suspicion that I just needed to upgrade the dongle firmware one last time. I had to try over 20 times for it to actually work inside of the software, and after owning over 100 mice, I have never encountered anything like this. It is pretty normal for firmware upgrades to somehow fail inside of a WebDriver or something similar, maybe like once, but having to try it over 20 times, even with the stock cable and following all instructions, I don't even know what to say. Anyway, I was finally on the latest version. I could use the Susanto dongle with the Susanto mouse. I played with it for 2 hours, and then mid-game, my clicks just didn't work anymore. It had a super weird defect where I suddenly couldn't scope in with my weapons anymore, and then sometimes when I actuated one of the clicks, it actuated the other one as well, and then eventually the clicks just didn't work at all anymore. So I thought that this could either only be a firmware issue or a hardware issue. But since the firmware upgrades were so volatile, I assumed it had to be that. I then reached out to Pulsar support yet again. I got a firmware flashing tool for people who have bricked their mice or their dongle. I tried using that and it actually worked over on the dongle, but it did not work for the mouse itself, and it was the correct specific tool just for the Susanto mouse as well. So yeah, we couldn't fix this mouse, and this is now a brick that is just collecting dust in my room. So the solution was to send out a new unit, and I did use the WebDriver to upgrade the firmware on this one. I downloaded the latest version of Google Chrome, upgraded the firmware first try successfully, and I have had no issues since. I did see that the firmware was newer on this one compared to the first unit that I got, so maybe I just got a faulty super early release unit, or it just had some weird QC issue during the firmware testing. I also, even on this new unit, have seen that sometimes when I use a different cable that is not the exact stock cable, it didn't want to work, and I had to like re-plug it into my computer again just for the mouse to work. But that issue I've only encountered like once or twice. But yeah, so far, not a really good experience. As feedback to Pulsar here, get your shit together. You're already using CompX and not your own drivers, so it better be working. I also do not understand why Pulsar don't use their own drivers and their own firmware, because they did actually develop that for the Feynman, but they just decide to use CompX for all their mice. And I probably assume it is because it's much easier and quicker to push out mice like that, because they don't need to do adjustments with their own development team. But for a product at this price range, I would definitely appreciate if this were their own firmware. I do think that this is a very niche case that I had with my mouse, and I haven't heard anybody else having proper issues with their Susanto, but since I'm an honest reviewer, I absolutely had to mention all of this. Anyway, getting into the unboxing experience, you get the mouse itself, you get this fancy pink dongle, you get some horrible flat dot skates that have no rounded edges whatsoever. I really hope that this was a mistake, because this is the worst add-on that I've ever seen in my entire life. You get a sticker, a collection card that looks like this, and then also this very hot pink USB-A to USB-C cable, which indeed is angled, but it is so stiff that I would never ever use this mouse plugged into it. But that is very normal, because most cables are very isolated so that 8K polling runs as smooth as possible and there aren't any interferences. In terms of build quality, I have nothing to complain about. This feels insanely solid. There is virtually no side-to-side movement at all inside of the mouse 1 and mouse 2 buttons. There is no flexing, no creaking, nothing. Super, super solid. It is definitely the most solid Pulsar product that I've ever owned. In terms of weight, with these skates installed, it's around 50 grams. And whilst the weight obviously doesn't bother me, seeing this at around 45 grams would be pretty awesome. But then again, this is not an issue whatsoever. Now, getting into the most important part, the shape. When I first felt the prototype last year at Gamescom, where they had a B2B stand and I actually talked to the CEO of Pulsar themselves, I couldn't wait for this thing to release because it felt so good in my hand. And when I actually started gaming with it, I definitely had to get used to it because these sides are very, very flat. If you know anything about me, I really do like flat sides. I'm all for safe shapes that anybody can use. I don't really like mice that tell you how to grip it. And if there has ever been a safe shape that doesn't feel like an absolute potato, it is definitely the Susanto here. But the reason why I didn't like it so much at first is because most mice actually have some taper here in the front. And that is because you don't grip your mouse like this, but you actually grip it kind of sideways. The fingers kind of come in at a slant gripping the mouse. It makes it easier to lift it and it makes it more comfortable to actually aim with it. So having a mouse with very flat sides takes a bit of getting used to, but after a day or two, I never had any issues anymore. You just need to get used to it by not putting so much pressure into the mouse itself so that you don't have these hot spots of pressure on your fingers when actually pushing in and lifting the mouse. The way that I would describe this shape is kind of a mixture of a mini GPX and a HDS Plus. For those of you who've used the HDS Plus as well, it is best described as a HDS Plus but with flat sides and no flare at all. But that's just the front and the overall size. And when you look at it side by side, it does look kind of similar because it's a center hump mouse, but it is definitely a bit lower. And when it comes to the actual feel of the hump, it feels very rounded. It doesn't feel wide and supportive. It feels very maneuverable in game, but you still have enough of that hump if you do a pincer claw grip so that you get enough contact over here. On the HDS Plus, you can definitely feel these angles over here where the hump flares out, and over on the Susanto, definitely not as much. I have definitely heard some people wanting me to compare it to the OP1 8K, but they're pretty different. Although they look similar underneath, the Susanto is definitely wider. The overall profile, the hump placement, the feel in hand is very, very different, but both mice have rather flat sides, and that's really it. The main comparison that I want to make is with the Superlight 2C. The overall size is very similar. Both mice are on the absolute edge of what I can comfortably use with my 19 by 10 centimeter aggressive claw grip. I do think that the 2C feels ever so slightly smaller. And as you can see underneath, the overall structure of the rear is pretty similar, but the front is definitely a bit more narrow and much more safe. And also it doesn't curve in super early like the 2C does over here. The rear feel is very similar, although the Susanto feels like it has more support, whilst the rear on the 2C feels very slim. I feel like this is a much safer choice to go for over the 2C. I didn't even have to adapt my grip for this mouse, it just worked. Where on the 2C, I definitely have to curl my fingers quite a bit more just to be able to use it comfortably. And so far, just from playing in-game, I definitely feel more comfortable over on the Susanto for sure. Getting into the coding, you can see that it gets very dirty, no matter how clean your hands are. I'm definitely a clean gamer, but this is an absolute fingerprint magnet. So if you have oily hands or you don't wash your hands chronically like me, this thing is probably gonna look disgusting on your desk. However, it is very grippy, and I do think that the trade-off is absolutely worth it. The coating is definitely a bit rubbery, and even with slightly cold hands, now that the temperatures are pretty low here at my place, I can easily grip this thing, and it feels very nice to play with. The skates are so-called 100% PTFE virgin skates from Pulsar. Whether that's true or not, I mean, look at it. Though the glide is pretty nice, it's not bad, and I would call these some of the better stock skates. They just won't feel as super smooth and fast as something like core pads, which are 100% PTFE for sure, but they're absolutely passable. They're not bad. In terms of buttons, they're actually pretty spammable considering that they're using an optical switch. They're using the Pulsar optical switch, but just think of it as like an arm-run optical, but more spammable, not as pingy, and not as tactile. It definitely has more of a conventional feeling. I'll make sure to do a sound test at the end of this section. The pre-travel is mostly minimal, and the post-travel is only noticeable if you click at the very far end of the switches. Other than that, the implementation feels great. I also have no complaints about these side buttons. The scroll click is also on the spammable side. It is not super heavy. The scroll wheel could be a bit more defined, but it is definitely spammable and it works very nice. It also does not feel cheap. I just would prefer some slightly more pronounced steps. Battery life also seems absolutely great so far. I've been using it for a week straight on 2K and I've only had to charge it once, so I really have nothing to complain about. Getting into the software, we're actually using a WebDriver now, and the page is called bbb.pulsar.gg. I'll make sure to leave a link in the description as well. On the first page, you see all your settings at a glance, which I think is very nice, and this should just be the standard for all WebDrivers, so that you don't have to go searching in your settings just to see what you're currently at. You can change the number of DPI stages, you can change the colors, which I find very nice. I don't like having a default red color on my DPI stage because if the dongle displays that color, I don't know if my mouse is starting to die or whatever. We are lacking some cohesiveness with some Chinese here and there because this is not Pulsar's own driver, they are using CompX. You can change your polling rate all the way up to 8K by default. You have 3 stages of LOD. I would definitely recommend turning on turbo mode just to get the highest performance possible. Whether you're able to feel the difference or not, I don't know. You could definitely start off with a debounce time of 0 milliseconds, and if you ever experience any double clicking, just go up 1 stage at a time, because they are using optical switches. You can set up your macros. I would definitely also recommend putting the low power mode to 0% so that you never lose any performance in game. And then you can also change the display mode of your dongle so that you actually know when you have to charge the damn thing. And at the very end, you have the awesome firmware updater. And if you ever update your firmware, I would highly recommend using only the stock cable and only doing it on the latest version of Google Chrome. If you don't want to use Google Chrome, just download it and only use it for firmware updates. You can also download a portable version online so that you don't have to install the whole browser. They do also have different profiles, which is pretty nice, but I can't really see why anybody would ever use that. Unless you maybe have a 500 Hz setting to save battery whilst you're working or something. But yeah, that's about it. If you hate WebDrivers for whatever reason, they do have a software as well, but it's not portable. It is an install. Alright, to the conclusion. Who is this nugget for? Well, obviously it's made for Forsaken and the other Susanto guy. It's their mouse, it's their shape. And no, it's not that Forsaken that cheated in Counter-Strike, it's the other Forsaken. But if you're looking at this and wondering who it's for, well, I'd say anybody with 19 by 10 hands or smaller. You could probably also aggressive clawed with like 20 by 10, but anything bigger than that, I do think that you're edging yourself because this is a small to medium sized mouse. But these sides are so flat, it is so safe, it's almost boring, but it's not to the point where it feels like a potato like the GPX. It doesn't have that bulbous round feeling where you feel like you're tilting your wrist up. It just feels like a normal, very safe and good shape. It also comes with something they call turbo mode, which is just 20k FPS scanning. So even if you run on lower DPI or lower polling rates, the click latency is still super minimal, but then again, that is not something that you will feel in game comparing it to some of your other mice, unless you're using an office mouse, or maybe even this hamster mouse from Amazon. But being a huge HDS Plus shill, I do think that this is pretty much a remastered version of it. It has flatter sides, it doesn't have any front flare, which was the only thing I disliked about the HDS Plus, and it's just overall more streamlined. As I've said 100 times in this video already, it's very safe to use, and if you like the HDS Plus, I also think that you'll really like the Susanto. It's just one of these mice that's very safe for all types of grip styles, no matter if you're a palm gripper, a claw gripper, a relaxed claw gripper, even pincer claw, but you're kind of pushing it with 19 by 10. And especially fingertip grip because the sides are so flat. This mouse does it all, and it does it way cheaper than the Superlight 2C. It's still not an affordable mouse, it is still definitely more expensive than Lamsu mice and other mice in that category, but I would definitely recommend it over some other mice that have very, very niche use cases, just like the REA RCC1 for example, which is absolutely made for aggressive claw. because if you spend 130 to 140 euros on this thing and your hand size is 19 by 10 or smaller, I can almost guarantee you that you will find a grip that works on this mouse and you won't have any true comfort issues. The build quality is great, the issues are not so great, but when it works, it works. From what I can tell, Pulsar support is pretty damn responsive, but I have seen some use cases where they're straight up denied issues and they had to get called out on social media just to actually fix the issue or send a replacement unit. Definitely make your own research here and decide if it's worth your money, but since most of you guys are enthusiasts already, just look at the shape comparison and see if it works for you. I'm a huge fan of the Pro lineup and I can't wait to see more shapes coming in the future because all of them that they've released so far are definitely unique and not just a straight up copy from something else in the market. They do take some inspirations with their shapes, but the pros together with the Pulsar team make it their own. That's about it for this video though. I've definitely yapped enough. And if you want to hear me yap more, definitely hit the subscribe button and the notification bell right next to it if you're at all interested in these type of reviews. And I'll see you guys pretty soon. Peace out.